with an expansion of attacks from Russia, pummeling Ukrainian cities, citizens, infrastructure with monstrous brutality. And now Putin's further empowering his aggression with the acquisition of Iranian ballistic missiles. So we're working with urgency to continue to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs to effectively defend itself. And among other things, we discussed long-range fires, but a number of other things as well. And as I said at the outset, I'm going to take that discussion back to Washington to brief the President on what I heard. I know that David's doing the same.
And today I can confirm more than 600 million worth of support for Ukraine, including 242 million this financial year for immediate humanitarian, energy and stabilization needs, as well as support for reform, recovery and reconstruction.
Let's be clear, we must condemn firmly what was the horrible terror attacks that Hamas has produced. But then afterwards, we have witnessed a series of military interventions by Israel in Gaza with a level of death and destruction that has no parallel in my time as Secretary General. Unfortunately, the institutions we have shown an enormous difficulty in making sure that accountability takes place. We have courts, but we see that the decisions of courts are not respected. And it is this kind of limbo of accountability that is totally unacceptable, and that requires also a serious reflection, namely in the context of the Summit of the Future and in the context of all attempts to do a serious reform of our institutions.
And she did.
The ABC News presidential debate in Philadelphia was full of attacks.
You're going to hear a bunch of lies coming from this fella.
And a series of false claims.
They're eating the pets.
The question now is, who won the debate?
And this is what's happening in our...
Immediately following the debate, Democrats and Republicans were quick to weigh in. California's Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom praised Kamala Harris's performance.
From the handshake and the fact she came over and she commanded the room and she put Donald Trump on the defense throughout the entire night.
While Republicans spoke out for Donald Trump. Stephen Miller is a former Trump advisor.
You see him talking about issues that you and your family care about.
Though Trump has said he's pleased with his performance,
This was my best debate. I thought it was very good.
Several Republican donors and 3 Trump advisors told Reuters they thought Harris had won the debate, largely because Trump was unable to stay on message.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
One of the most striking moments was when Trump amplified a false claim that immigrants in Springfield, Ohio were stealing residents' pets for food.
You talk about extreme.
Republican Senator Lindsey Graham is one of the few party leaders to publicly say Trump's performance was poor, telling reporters it was a, quote, missed opportunity. UCLA anthropology professor Norma Mendoza-Denton says Harris irked Trump at times.
She said world leaders started laughing at Donald Trump. Donald Trump is weak and wrong on national security. Donald Trump was fired by 81 million people. I mean, that's just, playing on The Apprentice, you're fired. So she's just goading him.
But a moment of unity came the following day when Trump and Harris made a rare joint appearance at a 9/11 memorial event in New York. The two were even seen shaking hands. Harris's campaign has challenged Trump to a second round of debate in October, and Trump has responded.
I would do NBC. I'd do Fox, too.
Está muy complicado.
It is very complicated, especially for retirees. I think it also extends to teachers and students who have scholarships. Everything is being cut and people can't take it anymore. Retirees are the worst off because that cut is the biggest.
Son los jubilados. My cousin Ruben died on 9/11 at the Marriott. He was never found. He is still here in Ground Zero. We need the young generation to take over, to learn about 9/11. Even though they were not born, they need to know what happened on 9/11 and continue with that it will never, ever happen again, and that we will never, ever forget these heroes.
We try to make it very positive, remember my dad and all the things and the way he lived his life, and we like our kids to enjoy New York City and know what New York City is about, being strong in community and loving one another.
This is my son Isaac. He joined after 9/11. I guess he just wanted to make his mark in life and also to give a better life to his daughter. But I come here every year not only to not let people forget the cost of freedom and why these men joined because of what happened here, and also to be with the other family members and let them know they're not alone in their pain. Yeah, so it's hard, but something you got to do.
Patricia Mary Fagan.
Ivan Krylos Barbosa.
Keith George Fairbairn.
Sandra Fajardo Smith.
Charles S. Falkenberg.
Thomas James Farino.
Nancy C. Dolazicki Farley.
Francis Jude Feely.
Garth Aaron Feeney.
Paul Robert Ekna.
Constantine Economos.
Barbara G. Edwards.
Dennis Michael Edwards.
Elisa Giselle Farina.
Anne Marie Celerin Ferreira.
Michael Bradley Finnegan.
Timothy J. Finnerty.
FDNY firefighter James Michael Gray.
Valerie Joan Hanna.
Thomas Paul Hannafin.
The US and Britain's top diplomats unveiled more than $1 billion in new combined support for Ukraine Wednesday. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and UK Foreign Minister David Lammy were visiting Kiev to hear Ukraine's war goals. In a press conference bookended by air raid sirens, both foreign ministers also hinted at lifting limits on long-range missile strikes into Russia, which Ukraine desperately wants. However, there was no clear answer by the end of the briefing.
And among other things, we discussed long-range fires, but a number of other things as well. And as I said at the outset, I'm going to take that discussion back to Washington to brief the president on what I heard. I know that David's doing the same.
Lammy and Blinken had arrived at a critical juncture in Ukraine's struggle against Russia. Russia has been advancing in the east, putting pressure on Kyiv. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pleading with allies to remove curbs on long-range US ATACMS and British Storm Shadow missiles to strike deep into Russian territory. But Washington and some European capitals fear that would provoke Moscow and draw the West into a direct conflict with Russia. Overnight, US President Joe Biden suggested there was room for compromise and that his administration was, quote, working out the long-range strike limits. While Vyacheslav Volodin, Speaker of Russia's lower parliament, said Moscow would consider the US and its allies to be parties to the war if they allowed Kiev to use long-range weapons to strike deep in Russia. Speaking on Wednesday, Zelensky revealed he will travel to the US later this month to present a plan to Biden and both candidates in November's presidential election that he hopes will bring the end of the war closer.
Scientists studying the new Mpox strain that has spread out of the Democratic Republic of Congo say the virus is changing faster than expected. And it's often happening in areas where experts do not have the funding or equipment to properly track the virus. Reuters spoke to half a dozen scientists in Africa, Europe, and the US who outlined a number of unknowns.
We are still working blindly in Africa.
Dr. Dimye Agoina is an infectious diseases expert in Nigeria who chairs the World Health Organization's Mpox Emergency Committee.
We don't have the required knowledge about Mpox, natural history, transmission dynamics, risk factors of Mpox. You need to understand your disease for you to develop or design preventive strategies against such a disease.
Mpox, formerly known as monkeypox, is a viral infection that causes pus-filled lesions and flu-like symptoms. Cases are usually mild, but they can be deadly. The virus has been around in Africa for decades, but an international surge in 2022 prompted the WHO to declare a global health emergency for about 10 months. Now there's a new strain and a new WHO emergency declaration.
The situation constitutes a public health emergency of international concern.
The UN agency says Congo has had more than 600 Mpox deaths this year, and more than 18,000 suspected cases of the new strain and its earlier iteration. There have been cases in 4 other African countries, as well as in Sweden and Thailand among people who had traveled to Africa. Scientists say a response is complicated by several outbreaks happening at once. In some cases, the spread has been linked to human contact with infected animals. It can also spread through close contact with an infected person. Mutated versions of the virus can essentially be considered a sexually transmitted disease, says South African epidemiologist Dr. Salim Abdul Karim, who chairs the Africa CDC's Mpox Advisory Committee.
It's case identification, contact tracing, and vaccinating and monitoring and treating, giving prophylaxis to contacts. So this is not rocket science. We do this for other infections. And so we can do it for Mpox.
An Africa CDC senior official said on Wednesday that the continent has secured less than 10% of an estimated $245 million needed to fight the surging outbreak. And there's no timeline yet on when hundreds of thousands of vaccine doses might reach the DRC.
Thailand's new Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra outlined her government's policy agenda on Thursday. It was headlined by plans to give away $13.4 billion in handouts to jumpstart the economy.
The government will push to stimulate the economy, build trust, and encourage spending, in line with mitigating the people's burden and costs, as well as increase job opportunities, where we will give priority to the most vulnerable group first.
Paetongtarn's cabinet was sworn in this month. Her policies include debt restructuring and legalising casinos to draw in investment and more tourists. Paetongtarn said Thailand faced challenges with structural economic problems and vowed to act with urgency to stimulate growth. But the Prime Minister gave no update on how or when the handout of $300 to 50 million people would be rolled out. The government had said this week it would distribute $4.2 billion of the programme to support vulnerable groups later this month. The scheme has been criticised by economists and former central bank governors as fiscally irresponsible. But the government rejects that argument despite struggling to find sources of funding. Ministers insist the policy is necessary to energise the economy as it struggles to grow compared to regional peers.
Can you command open forward hatch? This is going to stall it open.
At the bottom of the mobility is progressing.
I have a feeling the crowd is about to go wild.
Good call. Approaching the top of the mobility aid. Stay check. Back at home, we all have a lot of work to do, but from here, Earth sure looks like a perfect world.
Lilia Shulha has landed her dream job after years in what she described as boring, sedentary office work. Now she drives trucks with Ukraine's leading retailer, Fozzy Group. Ukraine has lost more than a quarter of its workforce since Russia's invasion in 2022, central bank data shows. And businesses are hiring more women in traditionally male-dominated roles. Childcare is in short supply though, and Shulha had to move back in with her parents for help with her 2 teenagers. Yes, people are curious and shocked when they see me. They film me on their phones when I deliver or load my lorry. They take pictures of me, whether it's passers-by or others, they're all in shock. Soon there'll be more of us, and people won't be that shocked anymore. Soon, it won't be news anymore that women work in such professions. Then people will leave me alone.
Millions of people, mostly women and children, have fled abroad, and tens of thousands of men have been mobilized. Reuters spoke to representatives of 9 Ukrainian companies who found that staff shortages and a growing mismatch of skills were big challenges. In the agricultural southern region of Mykolaiv, women like Maria Korolenko are being trained as tractor drivers, as well as tram and truck drivers, coal miners, security guards and warehouse workers, companies say.
I understood how necessary it was for me to work, not only for me and not only for my family. Right now, unfortunately, the men are being taken away. More and more of them are being taken away, and it's so hard. Now we do all the work that the boys used to do. When the war is over, when we win, the guys will come back and give us holidays.
Businesses have raised wages and are hiring more retirees and teenagers. Vodafone has repackaged its youth program to bring more young people on board. Ilona Voloshina is head of training and development in Kiev.
Right now, we're feeling the shortfall even more. If we look at the numbers from last year, around 40% of our specialists have left our shops. So we're feeling the lack of the workforce in the market.
The government and foreign partners have launched several programs to help Ukrainians reskill. But analysts expect the jobs crisis to persist and warn it could endanger post-war recovery.
Astronauts aboard a SpaceX capsule in orbit on Thursday opened the vehicle's hatch, and 2 crew members emerged into the vacuum of space.
The crowd is about to go wild.
Good call. They are the first private citizens to conduct such an excursion. Billionaire Jared Isaacman exited the Crew Dragon capsule first and had these words for the audience back home.
SpaceX, back at home we all have a lot of work to do, but from here, Earth sure looks like a perfect world.
Isaacman was followed by SpaceX engineer Sarah Gillis. Only government astronauts with several years of training have done spacewalks in the past. The mission appeared to successfully test trailblazing equipment, including slim spacesuits and a process to fully depressurize the Crew Dragon cabin. And it was one of the riskiest treks yet for Elon Musk's space company, the only private firm capable of routinely sending humans to and from Earth's orbit. Isaacman, the 41-year-old founder of electronic payments company Shift4, is bankrolling the mission. It's his second trip to orbit with SpaceX. He has declined to say how much he is paying, but the missions are likely to cost hundreds of millions of dollars.
Internet platforms could be fined 5% of their global revenue in a new move by Australia to prevent the spread of misinformation online. It's part of a worldwide push to rein in borderless tech giants, which has angered free speech advocates. Canberra wants to make tech platforms set code of conducts to be approved by a regulator. If they fail to do so, the regulator would set its own and fine the platform for non-compliance. The legislation, introduced on Thursday, targets false content that hurts election integrity or public health, calls for denouncing a group or injuring a person, or risks disrupting key infrastructure or emergency services. Communications Minister Michelle Rowland says it positions Australia at the forefront of tackling a growing international problem.
This bill ensures that digital platforms are accountable for combating mis- and disinformation on their services. The top priority of the government is to keep its citizens safe. Doing nothing to protect Australians from seriously harmful mis- and disinformation online is simply not an option.
An initial 2023 bill was criticised for giving the Australian Communications and Media Authority too much power to determine what misinformation and disinformation is, the term for intentionally spreading lies. The new bill doesn't give the media regulator the power to take down individual pieces of content or user accounts, the minister said. Some 4/5 of Australians wanted the spread of misinformation addressed, the minister said, citing the Australian Media Literacy Alliance. Australian leaders have complained foreign domiciled tech platforms are overriding the country's sovereignty, with the crackdown coming ahead of an upcoming federal election. Meta, which owns Facebook, counts nearly 9 in 10 Australians as users. It has said it may block professional news content if it is forced to pay royalties. While X, formerly Twitter, has removed most content moderation since being bought by billionaire Elon Musk in 2022. The platforms declined or were unavailable for comment. Industry body Digi, of which Meta is a member, said the new regime reinforced an anti-misinformation code it last updated in 2022, but questions remained. Australia's government is also running an age verification trial for social media before setting a minimum age requirement later this year.
Vietnam is reeling from the impact of deadly Typhoon Yagi, the strongest storm to hit Asia this year. But the chances of storms like Yagi are increasing as scientists say climate change is intensifying tropical cyclones. Nadia Blumendahl is a climate scientist.
There is general consensus amongst the scientists that tropical cyclones are getting more intense, that tropical cyclones are getting wetter, that storm surges are increasing, which is due to the combination of the cyclone being more intense and sea level rise. So those are three factors that we generally agree on.
Take Typhoon Yagi, for example. It intensified very quickly before striking Vietnam.
It was relatively weak, but it rapidly intensified as it passed the Philippines and went onto its way to Vietnam. And that's extremely remarkable to see typhoons undergo such rapid intensification in that region.
There is no scientific consensus yet around how climate change is impacting the number of storms in a season. But the timing of storms is changing as warmer temperatures, even in winter months, create the conditions for more intense storms to develop.
We published a paper where we looked at how the chances of a very strong tropical cyclone are changing under climate change. And what we saw was that in the Western North Pacific, and specifically in this region where Yagi also occurred, are that these chances are substantially increasing under climate change. And then we're talking 5 to 10-fold increases compared to present climate.
The world has already warmed 1.3 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average.
People in Vietnam's flood-stricken city Thai Nguyen began to clean up as water levels gradually receded on Thursday. The severe flooding was caused by Typhoon Yagi, the strongest storm to hit Asia this year. It brought heavy rains and strong winds, leading to widespread devastation. Scores have been killed since the storm struck, and many are missing, the government's disaster management agency said. Among those dealing with the typhoon's aftermath is inundated repairman Duong Trong Hoa.
There are almost 200 TV sets here. Some of them are mine because I also sell used TVs. But 2/3 of them are brought in by customers. There are just too many of them.
Confessing he felt very overwhelmed, he estimated it'd take a month just to check the damage to each TV set. Also working tirelessly is mechanic Nguyen Van Truong. He estimated around 80 water-damaged motorbikes needed fixing. Skipping meals, he works to ensure people have transportation as roads became passable again. Climate scientist Nadia Blumendahl said the likelihood of strong tropical cyclones, like Typhoon Yagi, are increasing due to climate change.
There is general consensus amongst the scientists that tropical cyclones are getting more intense, that tropical cyclones are getting wetter, that storm surges are increasing.
The world has already warmed 1.3 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average.
都是在水面之下。那其实呢，这本来是有一个，那玉江南宁水文段的水位呢，超过的警戒水位呢是3.18米。南宁市区段呢将在今天迎来这个洪峰及应急响应。那在昨天晚上9点多的时候呢，我们生子指的大桥上的车辆的通行状况仍然是一个正常的通行情况。我们在这个亭子码头的这些堤岸。
9月10号，受强降雨影响，广西百色右江区大楞乡省道323滑坡，道路中断，来往车辆出现滞留。当地迅速组织抢险力量，赶赴现场开展工作。在受阻路段两端设置了警示标志牌，共29条农村公路发生损毁。当地多部门道路抢通工作。截至今天中午12点，通公路中断29条，已恢复24条，正在疏通。
Peru's controversial former president Alberto Fujimori died Wednesday at the age of 86. Fujimori steered economic growth during the 1990s, but was later jailed for human rights abuses. His doctor, Jose Carlos Gutierrez, said the former president died of tongue cancer that was diagnosed earlier this year. Fujimori was filmed last year wearing a breathing tube and mask, leaving prison upon being pardoned after serving around 16 years behind bars. The son of Japanese immigrants, he was elected to office in 1990. His supporters say he saved Peru from terrorism and economic collapse. He tamed hyperinflation, privatized dozens of state-run companies, slashed trade tariffs, and set foundations for Peru to become, for a while, one of Latin America's most stable economies. Meanwhile, his government was fighting the Maoist Shining Path militants. Under his watch, the feared leader of the group, Abimel Guzman, was captured. Critics say Fujimori abused democracy and committed atrocities during his rule. He was accused of using death squads in his fight against militants. Fujimori also used military tanks to shut down Congress in 1992 and redrafted the constitution to his liking to push free market reforms as well as tough anti-terrorism laws. A slew of corruption scandals during Fujimori's 10-year administration also turned public opinion against him. They included one involving his top advisor Vladimiro Montesinos handing out cash bribes to politicians. After videos emerged of the scandal, Fujimori fled to Japan in 2000 and resigned by fax from Tokyo. After 5 years in exile, he decided to head back to Peru, hoping to make a comeback, but he was detained during a layover in Chile and extradited to Peru. Later, in 2009, he was convicted of ordering the massacre of 25 people during his administration's fight against Mao's rebels and sentenced to 25 years in prison. However, he was released last year on humanitarian pardon by Peru's Constitutional Court, despite criticism from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to block the pardon.
Gaza's economy has shrunk to less than a sixth of its size when the Israel-Hamas war began nearly a year ago, according to a UN report released Thursday. The report also found that unemployment has nearly tripled in the occupied West Bank.
The Palestinian economy is in free fall.
Pedro Manuel Moreno is the Deputy Secretary General for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which authored the report.
Gaza's GDP has dropped by an alarming 81% in the last quarter of 2023 alone. This has led to a 22% contraction in GDP for the entire year. In Gaza, 2/3 of pre-war jobs, approximately 200,000, were lost by January 2024. In the West Bank, unemployment has risen from 12.9% before the conflict to a staggering 32%.
The UN trade body said the Palestinian Authority, or PA, is under immense pressure that is jeopardizing its ability to function. The PA exercises limited self-rule in the West Bank. Declining international aid and revenue deductions and withholdings by Israel are also adding to the strain on the Palestinians, the report said. Israel also routinely deducts so-called martyr payments paid by the PA to families of militants and civilians killed by Israeli forces. Israel accuses the Palestinian Authority of supporting the October 7th attack on Israel. The PA denies promoting violence.
The report calls for the international community to halt this economic freefall, address the humanitarian crisis, and lay the groundwork for lasting peace and development.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's why 2 years ago, President Biden announced that the United States supports expanding the Security Council to provide permanent representation for countries from Africa, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean, that in addition to the countries we long supported for permanent seats, India, Japan, and Germany. In addition to non-permanent memberships for African countries, the United States supports creating 2 permanent seats for Africa on the Council. It's what our African partners seek, and we believe this is what is just.
2 nights ago, Donald Trump and I had our first debate. And I believe we owe it to the voters to have another debate. Because this election and what is at stake could not be more important. On Tuesday night, I talked about issues that I know matter to families across America, like bringing down the cost of living, investing in America's small businesses, protecting reproductive freedom, and keeping our nation safe and secure. But that's not what we heard from Donald Trump.
Louisiana residents were cleaning up on Thursday after Hurricane Francine tore through the area.
Francine arrived in the French Quarter.
The storm made landfall in southern Louisiana on Wednesday and has continued to barrel across the U.S. South, pounding the region with heavy rains and gusty winds. In Louisiana's St. Mary Parish, Dustin Wiggins was taking stock of the damage.
I figured I'd be fine. I was fine. The trailer wasn't.
He said his trailer survived Hurricanes Katrina and Andrew, but took a beating from Francine.
My next plans, I don't know. If I can even plug this hole at all, I don't know what I'm gonna do.
Francine weakened from a Category 2 hurricane to a post-tropical cyclone about 90 miles south of Memphis, Tennessee, the U.S. National Hurricane Center said later on Thursday, packing maximum sustained winds of 25 miles per hour. Heavy rainfall and tornado threats will continue across portions of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and the Florida Panhandle, the NHC added. The storm left more than 400,000 homes and businesses without power. Oil and gas producers said they were further curtailing output due to power issues. Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry and President Joe Biden each declared a state of emergency in anticipation of the storm. That frees up emergency management resources and potential financial aid in the event of serious damage.
What we're finding right now is a lot of stability.
right? We find at the national level that Harris is in the lead relative to Trump. But on those key fundamentals issues like the economy and inflation, Trump ultimately has the lead. And so really, at this point, we're at a stasis moment where at the national level she's in the lead, but things have not really changed all that much. To what extent was there or will there be a debate bump? I don't think there will be, but we have to wait for that as well.
The church has one foundation.
And the Son and the Holy Spirit. Peace be with you.
The US and Britain's top diplomats unveiled more than $1 billion in new combined support for Ukraine Wednesday. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and UK Foreign Minister David Lammy were visiting Kiev to hear Ukraine's war goals. In a press conference bookended by air raid sirens, both foreign ministers also hinted at lifting limits on long-range missile strikes into Russia, which Ukraine desperately wants. However, there was no clear answer by the end of the briefing.
And among other things, we discussed long-range fires, but a number of other things as well. And as I said at the outset, I'm going to take that discussion back to Washington to brief the president on what I heard. I know that David's doing the same.
Lammy and Blinken had arrived at a critical juncture in Ukraine's struggle against Russia. Russia has been advancing in the east, putting pressure on Kyiv. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pleading with allies to remove curbs on long-range US ATACMS and British Storm Shadow missiles to strike deep into Russian territory. But Washington and some European capitals fear that would provoke Moscow and draw the West into a direct conflict with Russia. Overnight, US President Joe Biden suggested there was room for compromise and that his administration was, quote, working out the long-range strike limits. While Vyacheslav Volodin, Speaker of Russia's lower parliament, said Moscow would consider the US and its allies to be parties to the war if they allowed Kiev to use long-range weapons to strike deep in Russia. Speaking on Wednesday, Zelensky revealed he will travel to the US later this month to present a plan to Biden and both candidates in November's presidential election that he hopes will bring the end of the war closer.
Poland's foreign minister on Thursday joined calls to allow Ukraine to fire Western-supplied missiles deep into Russia, saying the West should, quote, lift restrictions on the use of long-range weapons. His comments came during a joint news conference in Warsaw with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who said he had extensive discussions with Ukrainian officials in Kyiv on Wednesday, but declined to say whether the U.S. was ready to approve such strikes.
What we learn from our Ukrainian partners will inform discussions that we'll be having with other allies and other partners in the days and weeks ahead as we work through and think through the coming months.
Ukraine has been pressing the U.S. and other Western allies to authorize long-range strikes that it says will help to counter Russia's relentless aerial attacks. Russia has warned that any decision to allow Ukraine to strike Russia with long-range Western missiles would deepen what it called the direct involvement of the U.S. and Europe in the war and would trigger a response from Moscow.
devletimiz bu keyfi
I learned that our state has not let go of this arbitrary murder, that it has launched an investigation. I was very happy. God willing, I expect the same from the American government, because Aisha was 10 months old when she went to America.
Amerikan hükümetinden de bekliyorum. Çünkü Ayşe
She went to school there, grew up with the freedom there. She was a citizen there. So the American government also has a responsibility. God willing, the American government will show the same sensibility as the Turkish government.